opportunity to publish an article last year in the assessment update. We can provide a link to that article as well in the chat. And in this work, we developed a theoretical matrix of culturally relevant assessment where we discuss the elements of assessment types that we're going to talk about today and how those types can perpetuate equity gaps. So looking at assessment types. And also in the article, we juxtapose best practices that lead to reducing equity gaps. So as many of you know who are in the field and in the academy have often heard of the term culturally responsive or culturally relevant. But initially the term culturally responsive was coined by Gloria Ladson-Billings in her scholarship and research of teaching pedagogy. But most recently, Jankowski, Natasha, and Eric Montenegro proposed that culturally responsive teaching as well as assessment can be important practices for reducing equity gaps in student achievement. So today, as we move through the elements of CRA, which is culturally relevant assessment, keep in mind that all of these assessments are best practices that are good for all students. But more importantly, I think it's important for us that we consider these, because failing to consider each of these elements can truly interfere with the student's ability to do their best work. So let's talk about inclusive content. So what we mean by inclusive content is content that considers assignments that are aligned with teaching and learning. Now, anytime we test students on information that we have not taught, we are disproportionately harming those students who have less preparation and who have less confidence. So when we ask students to apply or demonstrate learning, we should be using examples that are equally familiar to all students. We must be sure that assignments and teaching are well aligned with the learning outcomes that we are trying to achieve in this particular class or an assignment. Therefore, if assessment and teaching are poorly aligned, you will see an increase in equity gaps in terms of student learning. So let's talk a little bit more about inclusive content and clear and detailed instructions. So as we go through including inclusive content in our assignment types and in the classrooms, the instructions should be clear for the students. So for example, when instructions are unclear, students who have stronger academic preparation will likely be able to understand what the instructor's intent was for use based on their previous experience with similar tasks. So therefore, for students from privileged groups may feel comfortable asking the professor for clarification, while historically underrepresented students may feel uncomfortable asking for clarification. So as assessment practitioners, we're familiar with scaffolding. So assignments should be scaffolded. This means that assignments should build on knowledge and competencies that are practiced in early assignments early on in the semester. Early assignments should include detailed prompts and instructions that allow students to succeed. Scaffold assignments help students have early success in the class, and this can build trust and prepare students to persist when assignments become more difficult. So let's talk about high utility value. Now, increasing utility value in assessment types. Utility value is the extent to which students perceive assignments to have value to them beyond the context of a course or a grade. Now, Eccles in her research discussed professional, academic, and personal value. So personal utility value is the extent to which students see the skill is needed in their professional career or in their academic skills, which has value to the students because they need that to be able to matriculate through the program and as well as their personal value. In addition, Heraclius in her research found that when students are asked to explain the importance of scientific material to their own lives, equity gaps were reduced for first generation and underrepresented minority students. So as you think about culturally relevant assessment, we need to also think about this notion of stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat describes situations in which individuals or groups believe that they are at risk of conforming to negative stereotypes about their group. So when you test students in classroom environments, it can evoke stereotype threat. So those who are affected may show reduced performance. In other words, any situation that highlights a student's race, their ethnicity, or their gender can evoke stereotype threat. And this also includes writing demographic information at the top of the test. Next slide, please. So based on our matrix, these are our predictions based on the analysis of the assignment types. So we're going to talk about these assignment types today. So let's look at reflecting writing assignments. Now these are considered to have low risk in producing equity gaps. And the reason why is because students, in these type of assignments, students are asked to describe and apply content to their own experiences, which are culturally inclusive. Students generally report that these type of assignments are high in utility value. Therefore, you can see less evidence of equity gaps in student achievement. Assignments that are considered moderate risk of producing equity gaps are inclusive projects. Now, again, inclusive projects or inclusive assignments, they're aligned with teaching and learning. They have clear, detailed instructions, and the examples are equally familiar to all students. And also in inclusive projects, it provides students with choices that can be of their inclusive content as well as their voice. So let's talk about writing in the discipline. Now, writing in the discipline, this is typically done by professionals from a particular field or discipline. And students perceive these assignments to have high value because they need this skill in their profession. This could include, for example, if it's a scientific class or a biology class, this can include lab reports. So in a student's profession, if they're going to be in a career, this skill would help them. They'll see the value in this particular skill beyond the classroom as well as into their professional career. Now, open-ended test questions are better aligned with teaching and learning. It allows students to express learning using their own words. So now let's talk about assignments that are considered at high risk of producing equity gaps. And these assignments are multiple choice tests. And the reason why is because they typically have complicated sentence structures. They're not always aligned with teaching and learning. And they can also evoke stereotype threat as well as lack utility value. Other assignments that are considered high risk of producing equity gaps are formal essays and homework. And they are likely to lack both our inclusive content and are perceived as having low utility value. So we can expect that these type of assignments are more likely to reveal equity gaps in student learning. So now I think I'm turning it over to Karen.
Thanks, Harriet. So, Harriet just brought us through our conceptual thinking around how utility value and inclusive content might intersect. And based on that analysis, we looked at some data from classes I had taught and another one of our colleagues had taught, and it actually suggested that there was support for this. But the next thing that we were interested in doing was seeing whether we could find out how students felt about this and how faculty felt about this. And so we created two measures, which in the name of time, I'm going to put all of the items up here and I'll discuss it with you all at once. Whoops. So questions that we believed would probe utility value and inclusive content. And so you can see the questions here. And what you'll see is, you'll recall that Harriet talked about how there's 3 dimensions of utility value. So just overall utility value, we tried to measure by this probe that this work would result in something I will discuss with others. But then we were also interested in having subscales that would measure personal utility value. So here we asked, would this assignment help you understand yourself better or have personal value to you? Academic utility value, would this assignment improve your understanding? And professional utility value, would this assignment provide you with experience that will be professionally useful? And we asked a bunch of students and assessment practitioners and faculty members to generally rate different sorts of assignments, like the ones Harriet described on the last slide. So to what extent would a multiple choice test do these things? To what extent would a formal essay evoke these feelings in you? To what extent would self-reflective writing do that, et cetera, et cetera. And we found that those 5 items had a strong level of intercorrelation. So when students highly endorsed one item from that set of 5, they were likely to endorse the other items as well. And so we've now been using this as a measure with students of how they view the utility value in assignments. Inclusive content, remember, includes a bunch of different dimensions. And in fact, at first we thought alignment and inclusive content were separate. So we came up with these 6 items that you'll see. Allow me to express my learning in my own words, make me feel confident I can succeed, allow me to relate class material to my own experiences, measure my true understanding, include examples and materials that are familiar to me, and include clear instructions. Now, as I said, some of those we thought had more to do with alignment. So for example, include examples and materials that are familiar to me, we had thought potentially was an alignment item, and including clear instructions we thought may well also be alignment. But students responded to those items as if they really were similar. And so when we thought about it, we actually realized that alignment is probably one subcomponent of inclusive content, because when your assessments are aligned with your learning, that content is equally accessible to everybody. Everybody's been taught it, essentially. So really what we want you to take from this slide is that we now have these 2 measures, and maybe to get a little bit more of a feel for what we mean when we're talking about inclusive content and utility value. And so then we, as I mentioned, we asked 162 students to use these measures to rate different types of typical assignments. And as you can see here, the students came from a range of lower level and upper level classes across a number of different disciplines. And these were the descriptions of the general assignments that we asked them to rate. And we have had faculty do the same thing, and assessment professionals. So the prompt was, please indicate the extent to which formal papers or essays generally. And then in each case, we had them defined as they are here. And what we found was that our initial thoughts about this model were largely replicated by students' responses. So we hypothesized that reflective writing would be high in inclusive content and high in utility value. And you'll notice now we're saying high or moderate utility value. So, you know, things weren't 100% black and white with this, but students confirmed that generally reflective writing did fall in that upper quadrant where they were high in both. Interestingly, we didn't really have any hypothesis about oral presentations. I've always kind of been a little negative about oral presentations, but students love them and believe that they are both high in utility value and high in inclusive content. So that was really interesting. The other thing that I found fascinating was we thought writing in the discipline would be low in inclusive content, because writing in the discipline is usually characterized by a lot of disciplinary rules. But in fact, students rated it as high in inclusive content. And what I think is going on there, I'd love to talk to some students about this, but I think in writing in the discipline, because the rules are explicit, that makes them have clear instructions, and in a way it does even the playing field in a way that we didn't necessarily predict. So when we have this question mark move up, what we mean by that is that we think writing in the discipline may have been misclassified and actually belongs in that upper quadrant. Inclusive projects, students viewed as having not so much utility value as we predicted, but high inclusive content. And then formal essays and tests fell exactly where we predicted they would, being both low in utility value and low in inclusive content. Just making sure there's no questions. Okay, so now I'm going to pass off to Christine, and she's going to tell you what we've done with this work at our institution.
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry, I'm muting and unmuting and stopping video because they are on my roof painting the house, making lots of noise. So I'm trying to cut down on that. So most people ask us, you know, how did we get started? What did we start? How did our work start? So what we did was we really thought about it, and we said, okay, we know equity and assessment is important, but where do we start? And so we thought, for us, at least at our institution, that we would start with courses that we thought would have the most impact on students if we could find that it made a difference in their student success. We also wanted to make sure that we had access to their information. So we have a learning management system, and so we wanted to make sure that faculty members were putting their information into that system and we could extract that. So we chose large classes with high DFW rates. Now, Karen just talked to, and Harriet just talked about our model. In order to use that, you have to make sure that the courses that you select have different types of assignments. So we chose courses, and so you'll see how many courses we looked that we reviewed. So we chose courses that at least had 2 different assignment types. So that means if you go back to the former slide, it was in, they were in 1 of 2 squares. Now the challenge was, however, that most of the classes that we identified that were large classes with high DFW rates only used 1 type of assignment type, and that was tests, quizzes, and exams. So if you remember, that is low in utility value and low in inclusive content. So that narrowed our ability to look at courses, a large number of courses. So we narrowed it down to 8 courses that actually had differentiated assignments. They at least included a test, exam, or quiz, and 1 other type of assignment type. And so if we move to the next slide, we will talk about how we disaggregated that information, again, using our learning management system. Our learning management system is Canvas. And so what we were able to do was go into that system and actually extract syllabi, because in some cases, if you look at the grading that faculty were given on different types of assignment types, you really couldn't tell if it was different than an exam or a test. And so we had the opportunity to go in and actually look at faculty syllabi to determine what assignment type that might fall into. For the larger samples to conduct analyses, so the issue is that you may have small n's. So in some cases, we went back a few years, and so we merged courses or sections that over time had similar assignments. We did include, and Karen, you can correct me because initially we didn't, but I think we added back missing assignments, and we inserted zeros where there were blank spaces. We also did not include those where folks, students just received a check mark or were given, you know, yep, they completed or didn't. We did not include that in our analysis. We did aggregate across assignments, and what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, a class had 13 homeworks. Well, rather than looking at each of the homeworks and how students performed, we gathered that and aggregated that into 1 category called homework. Additionally, in some cases, in many cases, faculty members recorded students' performance on assignments as percentages. But we did see in a few cases where, for example, out of 10 points, they gave them a 7. And so we converted that to a percentage so that we were consistent across all of the data. After we had, identified our courses and what students, we sent that information to IR, and they were able to add the demographic information such as gender, race, transfer status, native student, etc. So next is, what did our student demographics look like? I think that's our next slide. Yes. So of the 8 classes, as I'll just give some highlights and you can kind of digest this. Almost half of our students had transfer status. And you'll see in some analysis that Karen will discuss is that we compared transfer to native students and their performance on assignment types. Unfortunately, we did not have enough African American, Hispanic, and Native students to do separate analyses on. So what we did was we grouped African American, Hispanic, and Native American students into one category and labeled them, and you'll see in the upcoming slides, as unrepresented minorities, or URM. In the non-URM categories, we included white and Asian students. And so you'll see in the upcoming analyses that we compared URM to non-URM student performance on assignment types. Next is what classes were we able to look at in relationship to those 8. So if you as you read through this, you'll see, I will let you know that the first 4 courses, so math, comm, engineering, and accounting, are introductory courses. The second set of 4 courses are more advanced level: chemistry, information technology, psychology, and sociology. And as you look through the assignment types that were given, 5 of the 8 courses had 70% or more of the assignment percentage come from exams and tests and quizzes. The intro courses were more heavily weighted towards exams, quizzes, or tests. 3 of the intro courses only used homework as a different type of assignment. The more advanced courses used assignment types other than exams, quizzes, tests, and homework. And 3 of the advanced courses had less than 70% or more of the assignment percentage come from exams, tests, or quizzes. I'm going to go and see if there are any questions.
I don't think we've gotten any questions, but if anybody here's one.
Just came up from Chrissy. Did you consider class size as a variable? Large intro courses versus small and upper? We did not. I will hand it off to Karen.
Yes. So now I'm going to take you really quickly through the data so we don't bog down here. We do have a paper that's currently under review that presents statistical analyses for the data that I'm going to go through here. And we're happy to talk to anybody who's interested in more detail about it. But what you can see in these very complicated graphs, the top graph is showing you the points that are separating non-URM, so that was white or Asian students, from URM students, so that was Hispanic, African American, and Native American students. The bottom graph is showing you the same thing, points separating within those assignments, but now Native students refers to students who began their education at UNC Charlotte, and transfer students refers to students who transferred from another institution. The points are out of 100 because you'll recall that we converted all points into percentages. And what you can see is that the distance between the groups across points ranged from 0, and that's where you see no bars, to it looks like 13, I think it was, points separating them. The different classes, as Christine mentioned, are ordered from most introductory to most advanced. So within any category, like multiple choice tests, as you move to the right, you're moving to bars that are more advanced classes. And what we've done here, just to try and really introduce you to a massive amount of data very quickly, is we've grouped our findings into multiple choice tests. So that's the MC tests columns that you see first. FR tests are free response tests. Homework is the 4th set of assignments, and then writing includes all types of writing. So there was some formal essays, there was writing in the discipline, and in the paper we disentangle this a little bit more. I'm seeing the question, which group had higher points? So in every single instance here, the traditionally well-served group is receiving higher points or the same points to the underserved groups. So when we're looking at the top graph, in every instance where there was a point difference, underrepresented ethnic minority students are receiving lower scores on assignments than non-underrepresented minority students, and transfer students are receiving lower scores on the assignments than non-transfer students. What I want you to take a little bit of a look at is the magnitude. And so what we've been taking from this data so far is multiple choice tests are absolutely problematic often, but not always. So if you look as you're getting towards some of the more advanced classes, so for example, that information science class in the green bar, those multiple choice test differences are very small and didn't reach conventional levels of statistical significance. But if you look at the communications class, that light green bar, those differences were enormous. So multiple choice tests absolutely seem like they're problematic to us. But we also think that, you know, there's clear evidence that within those tests, there's some people that can do it in ways probably that have higher utility value and are better aligned. That said, free response tests are a whole lot better. So you'll notice that there's only one set of bars for the, I think it was the engineering class is showing up in the free response test. That's because there were free response tests where there were no differences. Homework has also come out as potentially being a big problem. It wasn't in our original model, and we're interested to see how students are going to respond when we ask them to complete our survey for real homework assignments. But we think the low point value assigned to homework may reduce its utility value to students and may be responsible for some of the big gaps that we're seeing. And writing, you know, you really have to look at the type of writing. So certain types of writing seem to be drawing bigger gaps than others, and unfortunately I can't remember enough to tell you which ones we saw there right now. But in summary, what we found from our analysis, in a more fine-grained analysis, which I haven't fully shared with you here, is that we're seeing frequent significant equity gaps in testing. And those gaps are there whether the testing is low stakes or high stakes. So there's actually pretty good evidence that frequent low stakes testing may help students do better in classes because it increases their academic self-regulation, which is sort of a fancy way of saying them being good students, right? If you have a test every class, you're more likely to show up in class, you're more likely to do the reading, but it still seems that those frequent low stakes tests can also be driving inequity because you can accumulate large gaps in points from those tests. Multiple choice tests appear to be significantly more problematic than free response tests. And when we looked at the writing in a fine-grained way, formal writing assignments appear to be more problematic than either writing in the discipline or writing self-reflective writing, where you're writing about your own experiences. Something we added based on this most recent set of analyses is that we think low stakes homework, again, is advised and useful in terms of supporting student academic self-regulation, but it may be problematic in terms of driving some of the gaps in grades. And so finding ways to boost the utility value to students of homework may be critical. Less frequent equity gaps we saw in free response testing, oral reports, and lab reports, reflective writing, and inclusive projects. So I will take any questions. Let me just see which group had the higher point values. I think I answered that. So unless there's any other questions, I'm going to pass off to Harriet, who's going to talk about, you know, where we think we need to go next is working with faculty to think about how we could increase utility value and inclusive content within assignments.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Okay, so how can we increase utility value? Can you click the slide, please, Karen? So in terms of us as assessment practitioners, you know, we always get the question, how can we improve in our programs and services? How can we make our assessment better? But today, in terms of culturally relevant assessment and the elements that we discussed early on in the matrix. So these are some things that we've talked about with our work moving forward with faculty and how they can increase utility value. One of the ways is to explain what academic utility value is to the students. So explaining it, I'm sure many of you heard students say, well, what does this mean to me? How am I going to use this in my career? Or what does this mean to me in my future? But really explaining to students the academic utility value in terms of whether they need this particular skill to matriculate to an undergraduate or graduate degree program, and then their professional value as well. One of the ways you can suggest a line that could be added to a resume, and then explain, as I said before, how it can be useful in their future. We're also Karen mentioned creating social pedagogy. So encourage students to share their assignments with their family and friends. And it could be an oral presentation, it could be something in the arts that they've done, but really showing the students that it has value beyond the contents of a course or a grade. And then create curated documents that showcase the students' work. Next slide, Karen. Any questions? So how can we increase inclusive content? Well, use accessible materials and consider the cost and content. Limit reliance on material that you haven't taught before. You know, we talked earlier about introducing students to material that we haven't taught on and how that is disproportionately harming those students. And then use scaffolding, which links back to just-in-time information, to give students an opportunity to practice those skills early on in the course. Then as they matriculate through the course, they build upon those skills. Have students to record video tutorials. Use rubrics that provide clear, detailed instructions and expectations for the students. And create inclusive environment. For example, blind grading, where you may be in an English class, maybe perhaps you, one of the things I think of blind grading is maybe associated with the number, or either a transfer, have another professor to grade without the names of the students, or the names being redacted. And diverse faculty and teaching support. So this could be offered through the Center of Teaching and Learning, or through the Office of Assessment and Accreditation, which we do. We offer that support in concert with the Center for Teaching and Learning. So really looking at some of the things that are already going on your campus and partner with other collaborators to bring this work forward. I'm turning this over to Karen.
Yep. So then the last question, which we've gotten every time we've presented this, is what do you do about tests? And you know, the one thing I think probably a bunch of you have noticed is the stuff Harriet just went over. A lot of that has been out there for a long time, and it's just good pedagogy. So, you know, the big thing to take away is it's not like assignments are doomed to necessarily have or lack utility value or inclusive content. And it's not like changing these things changes the nature of the assignments or the integrity of the assignments. And the same is true for tests. So, you know, things that we've come up with that we think would really help the inclusive content of tests. It's hard a little bit to change the utility value, but having students provide feedback on questions both before the test and during the test. So, you know, providing a place where students can write in things that confuse them about a question if it's a large class, and that can help the instructor identify places where the content isn't inclusive. So if a student identifies something that they should know, then that's, you know, they didn't know the material for the class. But when they identify something that is external to what they should know, it would enable the faculty member to recognize that the content was failing to be inclusive there. I'm a big believer in encouraging questions during testing. And what happens when you do that is generally privileged students are far more likely to ask you the questions because they have that feeling of the righteous sense that they belong there, whereas a student who feels potentially unwelcome or that they don't belong won't have the courage to ask the questions. So when you encourage questioning during class, both rewarding the questioner, so saying, you know, this was a great question, and then providing the answer to the entire class. When you provide the answer only to the person who asked the question, you're actually expanding that difference in accessibility because you're giving that person additional information. And same thing when you get questions in an office hour, making sure that you feed back to the whole class. We are really interested in using test blueprints. So far we've been at the level of looking at tests and seeing that some multiple choice tests, many multiple choice tests, are resulting in equity gaps. But within those tests, if you look at equity gaps on individual questions, that can be another route to identifying questions that lack inclusive content. Conducting item analyses is another route to this. So even without disaggregating at the level of items, if you find items that many students are struggling with, either getting student feedback from those items or reflecting yourself to determine whether those items lack inclusive content can be a route to increasing the inclusive content. Then whatever can be done to limit test anxiety. So the use of open book untimed exams will reduce stereotype threat and therefore make it less likely that you're seeing equity gaps that stem from stereotype threat. Providing all the questions in advance allows students to prepare and ask their questions in advance. I think oftentimes faculty are a little resistant to these methods, but really encouraging faculty to think about whether the knowledge that they're testing students need to be able to have memorized and recall under pressure, or whether that knowledge is something the students need to be able to successfully access. And I think, you know, especially as we're switching to remote instruction now, it's a golden opportunity to invite faculty to rethink those questions because it's so difficult to actually give a timed test that's not open book in a remote setting. And then finally, there's some small things that you can do to increase utility value. So actually explaining why memorization, fast responses, and skills in multiple choice testing are necessary for academic and professional success. So when I surveyed students, some of the students said that they thought, you know, there was a place that they could write in explanations for their responses. And they said that they thought multiple choice tests were high in utility value, a small number of students, because in order to become a nurse, they have to pass a multiple choice timed exam. So things like that, where students said, for my profession, this is a skill I need to get. And so if you can give students the idea of that as a skill, that can boost the utility value. Just looking to see if there were any questions.
Yeah, there was one from Chrissy who asked about, did you find there were differences regarding the disciplines of courses you were looking at, STEM versus humanities? And Chrissy, what I want to say is we were hoping to have a lot more STEM classes because they're larger in size, and that's where we have a high DF withdrawal rate. Most of those classes only had exams, tests, and quizzes.
Yeah, especially at the intro levels, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
I would expect there might be, but yeah, I can imagine that would be hard to find more differentiated assessment in some courses like that. Especially with that's why I asked about class size a bit too, because just having looked at, you know, a lot of undergraduate science courses, like, you know, sometimes when you have 300 to 500 students, you know, your methods of assessment are typically large scale assessments that we know are a little bit more weed out, a little more ineffective, you know, and it's like, you know, so I would assume that those, you know, are in there as you sort of look through this.
I do actually want to point out though that we included a math class, an engineering class, a chemistry lab class, a computer science class. So roughly half of our classes would fall under STEM. And you can't see it that clearly, but the math class, there were no significant differences in. That was I think it was pre-calc, so it was might have even been, it was a very introductory level math class. The chemistry class, the writing, there were not significant differences in, and I think the testing there were. The information science class, there was a big difference you can see here in the homework. Yeah, so, you know, Christine is absolutely right that there were tons and tons of STEM classes that we couldn't use, but there were classes that we could use. And I actually think math classes do a pretty good job of explaining the utility value of things like homework, at least, because it's so similar to what they're going to be required to do on tests.
Karen, if you could just go to the discussion slide, because that's
Yeah.
where I think we are right now. And then everybody can unmute themselves and type your questions in the chat or comment. But we do have some reflective, just go on to the next one, Karen. We do have some reflective questions for you. So how would you encourage faculty to examine if the features of assignments impact equity and student learning? And what actions would you take to encourage them to, specific actions from your department would you take to encourage them examining that? I will give you an example. For us, each year we have a small pot of money where we offer summer faculty stipends. They're just $1,000, but folks write proposals about what they want to do in relationship to improving, maybe it's course level or program level student learning. And this year what we did was, as an option, so we give them a number of categories. One of the categories was equity and assessment, and examining your course and examining the assignment types and how students perform. And so I think we had at least one, possibly a couple of other folks, but definitely one person take us up on that examination. I think Becky suggested that showing our faculty the data has been helpful in getting them to consider their teaching strategies and assessment types. Okay, a strong Center for Teaching and Learning.
You know, while people are thinking, I don't think I explicitly mentioned this, but we find it really interesting that there's very similar patterns for transfer students. And so, you know, I think that that's an important finding, because it really does show that this is broader than, you know, simply URM versus non-URM. We haven't gotten a good measure to look at first gen or low income students, but my hunch is we'd see similar patterns. And so really what you're talking about here is, how do you effectively reach students that are disadvantaged in one of many different ways. And I totally agree. When you show faculty the data, I think that that is a critical first step.
And so Becky, what I also want to say is that faculty have to be open to receiving what you share with them. Yes, I agree, Becky, yes.
Yeah, I do. I completely agree. And it's kind of like that law of the thirds. If you can get a third of folks on board and then share it with another third, and really get the momentum going. But yes, I mean, we have tried to find our faculty champions. Mm-hmm. We try to drive it from the assessment standpoint, but on our campus, it's really most important for faculty to hear from other faculty what's working and what's not. And whenever they see what's working, you know, with their students and how they can alter assessment methods to improve teaching and learning, I think they've been much, much more receptive. But your information is wonderful. Love it. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
If I can add something to a point you made, Christine, with the Scholarship of Assessment grants, we added a different scope. So that was helpful in terms of culturally relevant. So we kind of provided with them a precursor, if you will, or some context to what we wanted, what we were doing, and what we want to collaborate with them. So in the Scholarship of Assessment grant application, we added maybe 3 or 5 sentences explaining culturally relevant assessment to give them some idea of what we were working on to kind of garner their interest as well.
Is this my slide? So I will if this is my slide, I will do it. We want to give special thanks to our current graduate assistant who helped us in this analysis. We report to the Division of Academic Affairs, so their support. They also provide us with our budget, so definitely their support of this. And some of the students and faculty, and Karen, if you're interested, anyone wants to talk more, Karen and Harriet and I have been trying to understand how we get students more involved in the assessment process. And so we did have an undergraduate student work with us on that. And we're hoping to, through our undergraduate research department or unit, to have more students this year help us work on that project. And yes, and lastly, here are some of the references we use. I believe in the chat, I sent you a link to the assessment update paper. We are, as Karen and Harriet mentioned, we are crossing our fingers at the paper that we submitted to it's RPA, Research and Practice in Assessment. We hope that soon is accepted. It goes into more detail of our analysis. And I also believe, as Karen and Harriet mentioned, if anyone is interested in collaborating or working on projects, I am going to blank on this, so Karen and Harriet, you'll have to help me. But we have presented, or Karen presented last year, and the three of us have been asked to do it again this year at Linwood University, is that correct? On the topic, workshops for their faculty. Additionally, Karen and Harriet, you might have to help me out here. We have collaborative research projects going on outside the institution with some community colleges and teaching colleges, is that correct?
We're working right now with Maricopa Community College, Wabosi, I probably am saying. Wabansi.
Now we know that because I used to work there.
Community College. Those are the two that are really actively moving forward. We've had some interactions with other people, but they've had trouble getting their IRBs going, which can be a little tricky. But the next phase of the research, which is now just starting, is we are asking students to complete the survey for actual assignments in their class. So the students in the class are rating the inclusive content and utility value of the assignments they've been completing about 2/3 of the way through the semester. And then we're disaggregating grades at the end of the semester to see whether, when students actually say an assignment is high in utility value and inclusive content, will that assignment get smaller or no equity gaps. And we actually had our first class ever. We just looked at the data yesterday and we haven't discussed it with the faculty member, but it's somebody at our institution who has reverse equity gaps across the board in her class. And I am just so itching to find out what she thinks is going on. But, you know, it's so refreshing after looking we've looked at this point, I think, at 14 different classes, and we have never seen a reverse pattern. And, you know, in this class, it actually seems like the white and Asian male students are the at-risk group. And they're doing significantly worse across the board than, so the female students are doing fine, but white and Asian male students are doing significantly worse on everything than Black and Hispanic male students. So, you know, as we find some of these counter case studies, talking to the faculty members and talking to the students, I think will be even more interesting.
Thank you. Michelle, do you want to close this out? I see you've logged back in. Okay.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
I did log back in.
All right. I didn't know if you want to talk about the next topic or where